Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. And this past week, I was on a road trip, so this week's podcast is going to be mostly tidbits, but I will share a bit about a mystery that I came across on my travels and then how I finally solved it. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me via the Wool Channel newsletter. I've been talking about the Wool Channel almost every week for the past month or so. It's a new website created by Clara Parks, who's an expert on wool, and you can sign up for a weekly newsletter and she'll tell you bits and pieces of what's going on in the world of wool. And then for a fee, if you pay like $8 a month, then you have access to the community, which is forums where you can interact with people and find out even more things. So in this particular little tidbit, she shared a link to a video on a mill in the UK. So it's a mill that's 130 years old, or maybe even older than that, maybe 150 years old. And it's what's called a vertical mill. So what that means is that everything that has to do with the wool product is done at the mill. And in their case, the only thing that they don't do is scour the raw fleece. So they dye it, they card it, they spin it, they turn it in, they weave it, they create the different types of wool fabrics that they want to weave, the different patterns. Then they dress the fabric when it's done. They do all of that. This video is only a couple of minutes long, so it's kind of a little peek into what a mill is like. What's interesting about this mill is that they have their swatch books going back over 100 years, and they're creating some of these heritage fabrics that they haven't created in a while, but are still pretty contemporary in feel in terms of they're still the types of things that people would use today in wool garments. So I'll leave a link to that below. I would say another example of a vertical mill that we have here in the United States would be Brown Sheep Company. They do everything they don't weave, I don't believe. They don't make an end product like that, but they do the carding, the spinning, the dyeing, creating all of that for their own company rather than operating as a mill on behalf of other people who are getting their fleece sourced from one place and dyed in another and carded in another. They're doing it all in-house themselves. So again, I'll leave that link down in the video description. This next tidbit I found out probably either on Twitter or Instagram. It's a blog post from a young woman named Emily Whitted, I believe it's her last name. I'll put it on the screen here so you can see it. I came across her either earlier this year or late last year in one of these free online programs that had to do with fashion history and textile history, and she gave a really fascinating presentation about the textile industry here in the United States. So I've been following her ever since. So her blog post, which I'll leave a link to, is on mending and textile repair in early America. And one of the items that she was featuring was a pair of silk stockings that had been mended repeatedly. So these types of items are rarely found in museums. But what was really interesting about this particular pair is that they were owned by one of the wealthiest men at the time in what is now the United States. So the legs of the stockings were beautiful, but the feet had been repaired over and over. And they used several different mending techniques in these stockings. There was Swiss darning, which we also know as duplicate stitch, where you're kind of repairing thin spaces by tracing over the stitches so it looks like the knitted fabric. And then there's the other method of darning, which is more like weaving. And so I have both of those examples. And she was comparing it to what's this trend in the past couple of years of visible mending. So in the case of these very old stockings, the point was that the mending would not be seen by anybody else. But in the case of modern visible mending, often that is the goal, is for you to see the mended area and have it show up visibly in a decorative way. But I will leave a link to that blog post down in the video description. So this next tidbit is about me. I will be the June program speaker for the Minnesota Knitters Guild. We do our programs, still are doing our programs via Zoom. We've been doing them that way for the past year and probably will be continuing to do them. And even when we go back in person, we're going to try to find a way to live stream them to allow our members who are not in town, or if the weather is bad, to be able to join in and see the program. So the title of the program is Decade by Decade, One Sweater at a Time. In December 2018, unable to talk herself out of knitting an Edwardian-era sweater she knew she would never wear and assumed she would never finish, Roxanne unwittingly began a journey of knitting not just one sweater from a bygone era, but one from each decade of the 20th century. Roxanne will share the sweaters she has knit so far, as well as the discoveries she has made about how sweaters have evolved in the past 130 years in their construction, the techniques used, and in the way patterns are presented to knitters. So the way our guild works is that you do not have to be a member to come to the meetings. We welcome anybody. It is membership dues that allow us to pay for our programming. And during this time of Zoom, we've had more and more people coming to our meetings who are from out of state or from what we call the outstate area, which is outside of the metro area. So a lot more of our members who normally can't come have been able to. But also we've had a lot of people joining our meetings and finding out more about our guild that are not members, and that's totally fine. But what they are doing now is that members of the guild are given a link to the Zoom, and then if you are not a member, you can register for it. You are not required to pay anything, but we are asking if people can or want to give a donation of a couple of bucks to help offset the costs of the programming, that they can do that. But I believe you have to register at least 24 hours ahead of time in order to get that link. The meeting is going to be on Tuesday, June 15th. And the meeting usually is going to start at 6:30. There will be a trunk show. So somebody like an indie dyer or somebody like that will be presenting the kinds of yarns that they have. And then at 7 o'clock is the program, which is when I will begin speaking. And again, that is Tuesday, June 15th at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And I will leave a link to the Minnesota Knitters Guild website so that if you want to see more about it, then you can learn. If you want to register so that you can get a link to that program, that will be fine. So I'll be talking about things that if you follow my channel regularly, this project, this long-term project I've had of knitting a sweater from each decade, and it'll be sort of presented in a 45-minute to 1 hour blob, and probably a little bit different context than how I present it on a weekly basis here on my channel. This next tidbit has to do with resources for knitting patterns that are in another language that aren't available to you. If you only speak English and you find a really cool knitting pattern in another language, how do you go about translating it? So I've talked about this in the past, but not for a while. The reason this topic came up is because someone had messaged me asking me specifically about some books that I've recommended a number of times. There's a 3-volume set called Bäuerliches Stricken, and which is basically translates to country knitting or traditional knitting. These are traditional stitch patterns from the Int'l Valley in Bavaria, as well as Austria and maybe northern Italy. There were these traditional traveling twisted stitch patterns that are just gorgeous, that were part of the traditional costume in the stockings, and then eventually moved their way to waistcoats and sweaters, we would call them, close-fitting little sweater garments. These books, which are only available, they're available as a 3-volume set. They're by Lisl Fanderl, have quite a bit of actual history in them and some context and pictures, all kinds of things, but just tons and tons of stitch patterns as well as specific stocking patterns as well. And then there is a similar set of booklets by a woman named Maria Erlbacher, this 3-volume booklet set, which also is in Bavarian German. This one actually has very little text to it, so there isn't a whole lot to try to translate. And these booklets, they came from a museum. They also came with an English translation. Well, they came with a card that explained the symbols in their charts, and I believe I got an English translation of that, came with my copy of the booklets. But the difference between these two sets of books is that this set of books has been compiled into a single volume and translated into English. Again, there's not a whole lot of text in this particular set of books, but it's published by Schoolhouse Press. So you can get a lot of these types of stitch patterns through that book. And like I said, these little booklets came with a card, and then there was also a translation sheet, just a single English translation sheet that helped figure out what the symbols were. These books do not come with any sort of translation. And so that was the question that the person sent to me was, can you help me out here? I'm struggling with some of these symbols. And so I looked in mine, I could see that I'd written everything, a translation of it, in the books. So what I did was I didn't tell her what the translations were. I told her how to figure out what those words meant, so that she could see what resources were out there that would then help her in other contexts if she had other patterns that were in other languages that she needed to be able to translate. So I gave her a clue about what to do that. One of them is there's a yarn company called Drops that's in Europe, and they have an international glossary of knitting terms. So you can look up it by 2 columns. So like what language you want here and what language you want here. And so if you have English in the left column, you can pick, say, German in the right column. Now everything would be alphabetized based on the English terms, but you can go to the right-hand column at the top of the column, and you can click at the top of the column, and it will reorder the table so that everything is alphabetized by German. And then it makes it a little easier to find the knitting terms that you might be looking for. So that is one clue. But then if there are actual like sentences or paragraphs of text that you want to translate, what I had to do when I was working with these books about 10 years ago is I had to just type the entire paragraph into Google Translate. But nowadays they have a Google Translate app that you can put on your phone or your iPad, and you can have it actually sort of dynamically translate the words. Now, sometimes it's not going to make complete sense, but you might have to kind of like work out what these words mean in the context of knitting. But that will get you a lot further than just having the sea of Bavarian German. And then finally, if you are really struggling and you get most of it translated and there's certain things you can't quite figure out, there is a Ravelry group called Excuse Me. And it's specifically there to help with translation issues. You cannot go there and say, I have this pattern, who will translate it for me. That is not what, that's, first of all, that's not legal. Secondly, that's not what they're there for. It's specifically if you have done everything you can and you are struggling to understand a certain sentence and you can't quite make out what is meant, there are usually people who are native speakers and understand what that particular phrase would mean in a knitting related context in their language, and they can help you with that. So there are a number of different ways that you can go about doing this. These books are certainly the biggest resource for finding these types of stitch patterns. The charts that are in these books look quite different than charts that we normally see today in modern patterns. These books were created, I think, somewhere around in the maybe the early 1980s, and that would be before computerized knitting font systems would have been available. So they would have had to use sort of standard font systems using letters and dots and dashes and other kinds of symbols that we wouldn't necessarily use today. This next tidbit came to me via a direct message on Twitter from Sarah. And she said, I'm not sure if you have come across this YouTuber before, but Fiber Love Diary has been doing a breed study, and her most recent one featured Zwartbles. I thought you might find it interesting. So Zwartbles is a breed of sheep. It's a black sheep with a white blaze and a white tail, and 2, 3, or 4 of the legs will have a little bit of white at the bottom of the legs, have little white stockings. So they're natural black sheep. And I came across the breed in 2018. When I started 2018, that was actually when I started Casual Friday. I had some goals for the year, and one of the goals that I had was getting out more in the knitting community. And another by taking classes or volunteering at the guild, things like that. But I also had a goal of trying to knit more with other wool breeds. I just normally would just go to the yarn shop and buy wool and not necessarily know what it was unless it was merino. So I wanted to make a point of knitting with other wool breeds. And anytime I could find some, I would buy it, but it was a lot harder to do than I thought, which is probably why I had such a limited experience with various wool breeds. So one of the things that I found early on in the year was a sheep farmer or a shepherd in Ireland named Susanna Crompton, and she has Zwartbles sheep. So that's her flock, and it was lambing season when I found her. And I discovered that she would get her wool processed at a local mill. It was one of the few remaining traditional mills in Ireland. And they would turn her wool into yarn, but they also did weaving. So they're one of these vertical type mills. She had designed a specific type of blanket that represented Zwartbles sheep. It had some stripes on it, a few white stripes, but mostly was the natural. And I was just enchanted with this whole breed of sheep and watching her in her daily life as she was going through the lambing season. And I decided to buy a sweater's worth of Zwartbles yarn from her for my birthday. And so I got that yarn, and I started thinking about what kind of sweater I could design with it. I wanted to knit an Aran sweater from it. And I continued to look for other wool breeds, and I wasn't having that much luck. And I thought, oh, I'm going to go to our local Fleece and Fiber show, which is always Mother's Day weekend, and which is middle of May here in the U.S. And so I went there thinking that would be a good place to get yarns of different breeds. And I wasn't finding that. I was finding a lot of indie dyers. I was finding a lot of like what's called combed top that was dyed, that was ready to be spun. And there was a lot of raw fleece. But there wasn't a lot of like already milled yarn made from different breeds. Now, again, this was 2018. I think at that time in the UK, had been more of a resurgence of interest in traditional breeds, but I, and I was just early on in my search. What I realized when I was there was that, oh, I need to learn to spin, and I had been avoiding learning to spin for 13 years, and so I just instantly decided I needed to learn to spin. So I found out it was the Weavers Guild where I could learn to spin. And I took spinning lessons that spring and early summer And I also found out about a retreat that was through the Federation of Weavers Guilds. So the Minnesota has the big Weavers Guild is in the Twin Cities, and then there are smaller guilds throughout the state. And they joined together every year and they had a retreat. And I realized I wanted to get out more in the knitting community, but I'm just learning to spin. This would be a good way to meet other spinners, is to go to a retreat. So I went to this retreat, and I was wearing one of my hand knit sweaters. Not all spinners or weavers knit. So, people have multiple textile interests, but there's not always, knitting is not always one of them. But I was wearing a pretty fancy cabled sweater, and a woman named Charlotte saw my sweater. And she looking me up and down is, where do you live? And I told her, and she's like, oh, well, we have a weekly knitting group in the area. You should come join us. And her husband is also a spinner. He was there, and he gave me the card with the information about it. And they made sure to get me set up with the email groups and everything. And so I started going to this knitting group. And eventually, we all were at their house one day, and they showed me this blanket. Charlotte showed me a blanket that she had knit from little squares. She had done a breed study using 40 different breeds. And so it was like a kit that she had bought from somebody. So Charlotte and Neil gave me the name of where they'd gotten the wool for this breed study. And I looked, and of course it had been long ago sold. And I couldn't find any other resource for something like that. So what this message from Sarah was about was somebody with a YouTube channel who was doing a breed study. And I thought, well, that would be really interesting. And I went and I looked, and it turns out she had bought a 30 breed kit off of Etsy. So I clicked through to Etsy, and there was one kit left, and I bought it. I didn't even stop to look to see if there were any other breed studies. It was like the first time I'd seen one in a couple of years, because I hadn't looked. I hadn't thought to look since then. So it turns out, though, I did look, and there are tons of people on Etsy who have wool that you can buy for a breed study. Sometimes it's a kit of 12, and sometimes it's a kit of breeds from all over different parts of the world. Some of them are specifically UK or specific regions. And there's one seller who has 82 different fiber breeds. And basically you can create your own kit. Like if you wanted to do 10 of them, you'd pick 10 different things and pay for them individually, or you could probably get all 82 if you wanted. For me, this is an ideal way of kind of learning more about these different breeds without having to spin a ton of it. I think that's one of the things that has been overwhelming for me is, either have a whole fleece of something, or even if it's just 4 ounces, that's kind of not a good amount of yarn for anything that I would want to knit that I could use. And it's overwhelming to think about spinning an entire sweater's worth, especially since my skills are pretty rudimentary still, and the consistency that I would get over the course of that, is likely to be uneven. So this is a perfect thing. And my friend Charlotte, who had done one, what she had done on each square, she'd gotten these little textile labels that kind of iron on. And she would write the name of the breed on the back of it and affix it to the back of the swatch, so that she has this blanket that is basically a reference library of all these different breeds. And if she knows I've spun this before, what does it feel like, or what does it look like? And that could bring back those memories. So that is something I'm looking forward to. And I thank you, Sarah. for sending me to that channel. I'm going to leave a link to that YouTube channel below. The video that is the current one that includes the Zwartbliss wool also includes another wool. She was doing 2 per week, and so these were the last 2 in her breed study. So she has an entire playlist of all of the different breeds. And the other thing she mentioned was that she's, as a resource, so that she can learn more about the breed of sheep, she's referring to this Fleece and Fiber Sourcebook that tells her more about that sheep, what the wool is likely to be like, what it would be useful for, and that sort of thing. So between a text resource and the actual fiber itself, that could be a fantastic way to learn more about different wool breeds. So I am a big fan of the Great British Bake Off, which here in the US we call the Great British Baking Show, because the term bake off is a trademark term from the Pillsbury Bake Off. But I'm a big fan of that show. And then earlier this year, I found out that HBO Max had one called The Great Pottery Throwdown, which is from the same production company in the UK. And a few years ago, I came across the Great British Sewing Bee and was able to watch the first season of that. It was only 4 episodes the first season. Again, same production company. And I was never able to find other episodes. I've looked repeatedly. Anytime on social media I hear people talking about it who are from the UK, I go and look to see if it's streaming anywhere, and it's never streaming. I have contacted their production company. I've contacted, like, why is this not available on like Acorn TV or BritBox or something like that? Why can't we get this here? Well, season 7 is now underway. So they've had, 5 seasons after the season that I was able to see, and now they're in the 6th season since then. And so I have a friend who has been able to watch this show, and it's not streaming. It's not available for streaming, but it is possible to see this show in other ways. So I got caught up on it, and I got really interested in some of the challenges. The way the format of this show works is that there are 3 challenges. They start off with 12 contestants, and the show goes for 10 weeks. Early on, it was fewer contestants and fewer weeks, but now it's 12 contestants, 10 weeks, and they get rid of one each week. They have 3 challenges. One is something that everybody has to make. It's a pattern challenge to show that they can actually follow pattern instructions exactly. One of them is a transformation challenge where they're given some kind of item of clothing. It might be like a Hawaiian shirt, or it might be a pretty drab, plain dress that they need to transform in some way. So they have to change it significantly from what it is into something else, which kind of shows their creativity and how their brain works and their ability to sort of look at the different parts of a garment and reimagine it in a different way. And then the third challenge is one that they're able to practice. It's a pattern that they've designed, or a pattern that they bought, but it has to do with whatever the theme of the week is. And then they have 5 or 6 hours in order to sew that particular thing. So there's always this time pressure element to it. And for each of these projects, the ones where it's either the pattern challenge or the one that the contestant has chosen themselves that has to do with the theme for the week, the judges are looking for specific types of things, for specific skills. They know what parts of that item are going to be challenging, and they're going to be looking for the perfection in that particular area. So this has been really interesting to me since I've gotten back into sewing, and I found that there are a number of YouTube channels, as there always are for these kinds of things, where people kind of go over, rehash what went on, what did they like, what did they not like, what did they think of the challenges, what did they think of the results, who do they think is going to really end up on top toward the end. And there's a challenge, or there's a channel by a man named Stuart. He has what they call a haberdashery shop in the UK, which is different from what a haberdashery is here in the US. My understanding is a haberdashery is like basically a craft store, like sewing notions, yarn, that kind of thing, not necessarily a fabric store. And I don't know like what a fabric store, if that would be called a fabric store. Like here in the US, we have fabric stores and craft stores. And then we have the big box craft stores. And craft stores may or may not carry fabric here. But they might have all kinds of other things. And often they will have yarn for sure. I'll leave a link to this particular channel, this guy Stuart, who has I think he's a quilter. So he carries some fabrics, but a lot of yarn and things like that. For this season, he is doing a second sort of rehash video. So he does it with his two friends and they talk about, what they think. Then he does another one that's with a woman who is the master tailor. And Couturier, I think is the other name. She grew up learning a ton about dressmaking, was in the banking industry for a while, quit that, and then moved to the UK. She's from the US. And she went to Savile Row and she learned tailoring there. And so she focuses on tailoring for women. So it's fascinating to hear her talk about her take on the different challenges and some of the things that seem strange or interesting. But what she also does is do some tutorials on the things that were specifically tricky. Like her approach to here's how you do it. She's a very calm voice and she's very good at showing you very specifically how to do things. And she lays it out in such an organized way. So she also has a YouTube channel called I Never Learned to Sew. And I think it's only about a year old and it's not a huge channel, but she has a playlist of basic sewing skills that I thought was incredible. A lot of them are hand sewing skills. They're each only a couple of minutes long, but they are so specific and so excellent in terms of here's what you do, here's why you do. It's very much my way of approaching knitting as well. But here's what you need, here's what you do, here's what you're looking for, and it's just an incredible YouTube channel. So I'm going to leave links down below to her channel, to Stuart's channel, where he's talking with her about the show, and then she's doing some demonstrations of different techniques. And then I'll also leave you a link to on Reddit, which is a website where people discuss various things, but there's a Reddit thread on the Great British Sewing Bee that has links that might help you be able to see the show yourself if you are not able to get it on a local TV channel like I am not able to. Last Friday was the 2-week anniversary of me getting my second shot of the vaccine. So after I published last week's Casual Friday, I went downstairs, I packed up a suitcase. We got up at 4 a.m. on Saturday, and at 5 a.m. we left and drove to Michigan to visit my mother. So normally I would knit in the car, but I was so tired and I was at a point in this project where I needed to do some calculations and some measurements, and I needed to really pay attention to what I was doing on every single row. And on top of that, one of the things that I've noticed when I'm knitting on a car trip or in an airplane, my elbows tend to be up a little higher, and that alters my gauge. It tends to loosen up. And so I really didn't want to work on this in the car, and I was too tired on the way there. When we were there, I wasn't really knitting either. My mother has dementia and it's getting pretty bad. We were focusing on her and her husband, and I was not doing much knitting. But I will show you what I did do. It took me so long to do this. I sat at the table one morning and decided to figure out the button placement for this. And I also realized that I may not have knit the button band. I might be short 3 or 4 rows before I should have started the shaping, just because of the way the decreased shaping kind of pulls in this direction. That was another thing. I was like, oh, I'm not in the mood to rip anything out. So I needed a little bit of a clear head to kind of think through how I'm going to do this. But I did figure out where I was going to place these buttonholes, or these are the button placement, and so the buttonholes will be placed on this piece as I knit it. So I have one buttonhole at the very bottom edge here, and then I will need one that's an inch, apparently an inch and a half from the top, which kind of surprised me and which led me to realize I hadn't knit the button band quite long enough. So I will be working on that over this week, but I just didn't have the heart to do it while we were in Michigan. So that is put to the side. But while we were there, I was talking a little bit about getting back into sewing, and I asked my mom's husband about my mother's sewing machine, because a couple of years ago they really downsized a lot of their stuff in order to move into a retirement community. They were there for a year, didn't like it, ended up moving back into their house. So they don't have a lot of stuff anymore. But I did ask Al. He wanted to make sure, he's like, is there anything you want before I start getting rid of things and giving things away? Anything you want from the house? And I had said, oh, I want, just don't give away the sewing machine. I'll get it. I'll pick it up at some point, when I'm out for a visit. And I had forgotten about it until we were on this visit. And I said, oh, where's Mother's sewing machine? And he's like, oh, it's in this room in a closet on a shelf. And so I went into the closet, I opened the door, and there is a sewing machine that I did not recognize and 2 sewing baskets that looked to be like vintage baskets. Again, did not recognize them at all. And I'm like, whoa, what is this? And so I said, this isn't the sewing machine that I was talking about. And I found a picture of my mom had an Elna Supermatic 2 that she got in late 50s, probably right after she got married. That was the machine I grew up with. It had some fancy stitch patterns that you could use by using these things called cams. They're like discs with a hole in the center that you'd put inside the machine, and then it would know to do a zigzag or a blind hem stitch or things like that. It was a nice machine, but totally mechanical. And I showed him a picture. He did not recognize it. And he thinks probably what happened was when he invited somebody over, they could take whatever they wanted that was left. And he, in his mind, had saved the sewing machine as I had asked him to, exactly like I asked him to. I'm not upset. As long as somebody got it that really wanted to use it, I'm totally fine with that. But I still needed to solve the mystery of this other sewing machine. I couldn't understand. It looked very similar to mine, and that's not the same brand. Mechanical, maybe had a little few different bells and whistles that mine, which was made in 1985, didn't have. And so I started looking through this sewing box. So this is the sewing box. Let me move the camera so you can point it down a little bit so you can see what it looks like. So these 2 sides open like this, and then they continue to open like all the way out like this. And so there are all of these, tons and tons of sewing machine needles and just hand sewing needles, a ton, like this is full of hooks and eyes. There's a lot of different threads in here. These I recognized these as my mother's pinking shears, but this I did not recognize as hers at all. But I kept finding things that I've recently purchased for myself, like tracing wheels for patterns, just a bunch of different stuff, a lot of sewing notions, but it was a really cool box. So I brought it back with me, but there was one thing in here that was really, really strange. So when I found this in the sewing box, I could see Dritz was written on it, which is a very popular brand of sewing notions here. And I saw this crisscross in the back, and I could see that there are these little loops. And I thought, well, if this was supposed to be something that was used on a sewing machine, having these crisscrossed wouldn't make sense. I had no idea what it was. So I went on Ravelry and asked in the tools forum, which was really a mistake because I knew it was a sewing thing and I shouldn't probably have asked it there, but I got an answer right away. I asked if anybody knew what this was, and somebody said that they said it was for making handmade buttonholes, and that you would clamp the fabric. Like if you had a piece of fabric that somehow you would clamp it on there and you could do your buttonhole. That didn't quite make sense to me, but it gave me an idea for looking up buttonhole tool. It turns out this is for sewing machines. This does clamp onto fabric, but it clamps on in this particular way. And it's used for making a kind of buttonhole that I hadn't heard of, which is called a bound buttonhole. So I'm going to leave a link below because I think this is kind of interesting to see how these are the kinds of buttonholes you'd find in like a fine tailored garment or like a coat, where the thread buttonholes maybe wouldn't be sturdy enough or appropriate to use. So this is just a really cool tool that I had never seen before, and I believe they still make these. This one obviously is a vintage one, but apparently they still make these, and I've seen lots of YouTube videos from people demonstrating how to use this type of tool and how to make a bound buttonhole. So I am going to practice that just to see what that's like and what I think of it, and add that to my little list of things to try. So while I had solved the mystery of why my mother's sewing machine wasn't in the house, because Al had assumed that this other sewing machine was the one I was talking about, I still wasn't clear on who or where this particular sewing machine came from, and these sewing boxes that I didn't recognize either. I finally found a clue as I was putting this vintage sewing box back together. I spotted an address label on the side, on the inside of one of the compartments. It had my grandparents' name and address on it. And so then I understood this is why I hadn't recognized any of it. This was my grandmother's sewing equipment. When my grandparents died 3 weeks apart from each other in early 1992, I had gone with my mother to their apartment, and I had taken all my grandmother's knitting needles and patterns and all of that stuff. But I don't know that I had even known about the sewing stuff. And at that time, my sewing machine was only a few years old, so I wouldn't have wanted that sewing machine if I'd even known that it existed. So I was just happy that we solved the mystery of where these sewing boxes came from and whose machine that was. So I brought the machine back, and I've been testing it out side by side with mine. They're very close in terms of features, and I'm just playing with that old machine, my grandmother's old machine, to see if it's the same or better or worse than my particular machine, so I can decide which one I'm going to use going forward. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.